Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone, welcome our simulcast viewers, and as always, thank Howard Weeder, the Canada Excellence Research Chair, for underwriting this seminar series. Just to let you know, next week we have Aaron Wolf coming from Oregon State University. Aaron does transboundary water treaty negotiation, water policy, so if you're working in that area, make sure to come and join us next week. But today it's a great pleasure to welcome Naomi Tague from the Bren School at UC Santa Barbara. And this is the story of a Canadian girl makes good. She started off in Newfoundland, did a master's, or undergrad I guess, in systems design engineering at Waterloo, and then went on to Toronto for her master's and PhD degree, that she finished I think about 15 years ago. Then did a postdoc at UCAR, and then had a stint as assistant and associate professor at San Diego State University. And she's been now at UC Santa Barbara since I think about 2006. Naomi does a lot in this field of watershed modeling. I think most notably, she's the principal developer of Rhesus that you're going to hear probably a bit about this afternoon. Which is an eco-hydrologic model that's used by many in the community, but Naomi really provides the model development, testing, and user support for the community. And this is quite a growing community. And I think Naomi's work has really led us to kind of integrate eco-hydrological processes in a modeling framework, really like no other groups working today. She's very active within AGU. She chairs the Langbine committee and is one of the most sought after invited speakers I know at various conferences where I've tried to get her to speak. She's just back from the British Hydrological Society where she was the opening keynote. So it's absolute delight to have Naomi with us, and she's going to tell us about why geology matters. Naomi.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I always really like excuses to come back to Canada. I really miss snow, so I'm a little upset that it's not snowing. But as Jeff points out, I'm going to talk about why ecology matters, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about drought, because mostly I'm going to talk about why geology matters when we think about drought. And whenever you talk about drought, it kind of, what do you mean by drought? And the IPCC has this definition that relates drought to a deficiency of precipitation, which, if you do a lot of forest ecology, is kind of, well, what do you mean by deficiency? Well, it means that there's a water shortage for some activity or some group. Well, I'm going to think about shortages both for forests, right? Forests are a group. Forest, does this work? Forests are a group. They need water. We are also a group that care about water, right? So I'm going to talk about issues around us not having as much water as we like, and forests not having as much water as they would like. Now, forests don't really like or not like things, and if Jim Kirchner was here, he would yell at me for saying that, but it changes their function, right? So when does drought actually do something which causes forests to behave in some different way? And so I'm really going to look at how changes in supply and demand impact forest productivity and their sensitivity to disturbance, things like fire and disease. And what implications do these types of change have for stream flow, water for us and water for fish? I'm going to talk at the end a little bit about whether forest management can mediate some of these effects. But underneath it all, I'm mostly going to have this theme about, well, why you would have to be thinking about geology in answering these types of questions. So just to put this in perspective, let's say figure out how to advance. I am from California, and drought right now is really mattering to us. I think this figure gives you a nice perspective on that. You can see that these are all graphs showing where our reservoirs, all the reservoirs that support water supply in California, where they are at. The red line shows historic average. The blue is where they were October 17th of this year, right? And you can see we are below normal. We are drastically below normal pretty much everywhere. Our reservoirs kind of look like this, which is not a good thing for California. Well, why is that? Well, it's basically because we've had a couple of low precipitation years right in a row. This is a precipitation deviation. So blue are years where precip was above the historic average and redder years where it's below the historic average. And you can see part of the problem is we've had a bunch of years with lower than average precipitation. And that really is the reason that we have this drought. But I think it's worth noting, there's no real trend in this data, right? It's just, we've had droughts like this before. It's a particularly severe one, and we probably will have droughts like this again. What is worth noting is if you look at deviations of annual temperature, this is from one particular Sierra watershed, but you can see it is certainly true that things are getting warmer, right? So warming matters in terms of drought in places like the Western US, and I think this is also true of Western Canada, because you have a situation where most of the precipitation, this shows mean monthly precipitation for a number of different watersheds in the Western US, it mostly falls during the winter. A lot of it falls as snow. So most of the recharge to forests happens during the spring. And most of the recharge to reservoirs also happens around that same time. And even though there aren't trends in precipitation, there's a pretty clear trend in snowpack, with declining decreases in snowpack throughout much of the Western US. And for many places, the snowpack melting several weeks earlier, right? We see these trends also in stream flow. This is a graph showing statistically significant trends in the timing of when water leaves the watershed. And that matters, right? Because we want water in the summer, not in the winter. So any shift towards earlier means that water's coming out when we don't need it, right? We need it to support agriculture during the summer. So these trends matter for us. But they also matter for forests, and forests use a lot of water. Forested areas cover a lot of the region that I'm talking about, shown in green here. This big yellow patch is the Central Valley, where you have the agricultural part of California, but all of this green area is basically the land that supports the water that we use for agriculture. And most of that is indeed forests. And this is a slide from my friend Gordon Grant, which I really like and I stole. I forgot to credit him, so I'm crediting him now. But this just shows how much water forested land in the US, right, uses, right? And, it's the biggest user of water. It uses a lot of water. It uses as much more water than flows in the Mississippi River. It's a lot of water. But forests need water. And there's a lot of evidence. There's a recent paper by Craig Allen that shows evidence of forest dieback due to drought stress increasing throughout the globe, right? Dry forests also burn, right? Water conditions, drought for forests often also mean fire. So forests are very vulnerable to changes in both temperature and precipitation. If you think about this conceptually, right? In water-limited regions, how much water do forests actually use? Well, in water-limited regions, the more precipitation, P, you have, the more ET you have. When temperatures warm up, a couple of things happen. One, you get bigger vapor pressure deficits in the air, so forests need more water. They use more water, right? Also, if you're in a place where physiological activity is limited by temperature, warming things up will increase ET, because essentially you're increasing the length of the growing season. But changes in snow dynamics, if all of your water inputs happen during the winter, can also change ET, right? Because the timing of water supply relative to when forests would use that now changes, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this and talk with examples from the California Sierras. I just put this little reference here. It's also worth noting that, are there trends in precipitation? Well, in some places in the world, places like the Western US, it's really hard to tell. Sometimes it's going up or sometimes it's going down. But temperature for sure is increasing. And we can see this change in snowpack visually. Here's a remote sensing image of snowpack for 2013 and then 2014, right? So one of the reasons we have really low water in our reservoirs this year is simply we just didn't get a lot of precipitation, right? And if most of our precipitation falls as snow, then low snow years are also low precipitation years. So these graphs show some relationships between NDVI and SWE. SWE is, in this case, the peak amount of snow you get in a particular year, so how much snow you got. NDVI is a remote sensing derived index of how happy and productive your vegetation are. Don't worry about what that means, just notice that there's a pretty good relationship here. There's a strong R squared for different species, but particularly for forests. The amount of SWE you get, the amount of snow you get, is a good predictor of how productive those forests are. And this is an observation. Part of the problem with this observation, though, is you can't disentangle whether forests are more productive just because you had more water in that year, regardless of whether it was snow or rain, right? You can't disentangle that because bigger snow years tend to be bigger precipitation years. And we want to be able to disentangle that because with the warming trends, precipitation may not change, but it's pretty for sure that things will get warmer. So more of that precipitation is going to fall as rain. So how do we work that out? Well, now we get to Rhesus that Jeff was talking about. We use mechanistic models, right? The type of models I'm talking about are models where we have mathematical representations of a lot of the processes that determine how this forest ET works out, right? And these models I sort of think of as evolving documentation of what we learn from intensive monitoring sites, right? And they're able to account for these nonlinear combined responses of different processes, temperature, moisture, snowpack controls in different situations, right? The model that I developed is called Rhesus, or I'm one of the principal developers of, and it models the processes that would be important in thinking through these problems. We have a snowpack model. We model rooting zone moisture storage, the drainage of that, the use of that by the vegetation for transpiration. We model canopy evaporation, understory and litter evaporation. And this is tightly coupled to an ecosystem carbon cycling model. And this becomes important because we can get feedbacks between changes in water use and changes in growth, right? So in years where you don't have enough water, you have less primary productivity. You grow less, you put on fewer needles the next year. We can capture those kinds of dynamic feedbacks. We also model nitrogen cycling, but I'm not really going to talk about that today. It's a spatial model, so we account for spatial variation in energy drivers of things like snowpack and evapotranspiration on the landscape. But it also moves water laterally around in the system. So we can account for things like riparian zone that get recharged not just locally, but from water that came from another part of the watershed, right? So I can answer more specific details about the model later, but that's basically the processes that we're modeling. So let's run this model for one of these Sierra watersheds, right? I'm picking Stagehands Creek. It has a range of elevations. It has this typical precipitation pattern that we see in the western US. And it's a conifer-dominated watershed. Just to show you that I can capture some of the processes we're interested in, this shows a hydrograph of stream flow on a log scale, so you can see that the red is observed, the black is model. We do a reasonable job of capturing the stream flow patterns. So we can use this model then to say, well, what happens if things just warm up and the precipitation patterns stay the same? So we do this partly. This shows the percent basin snow cover. These gray dots show trajectories for all the years since the 1970s, right? The blue shows the average of those 30 years or so. The red shows how things will change on average if we warm things up by 3 degrees. So we get a situation where we don't always get the basin completely covered by snow. Some areas now just get rain. And the snow melts earlier, right, even at high elevations. So we take these trajectories and we say, what does it predict about the change in ET? So now we're looking at two competing forces, right? On one hand, things are turning on earlier, right? The growing season is longer, things are warmer, the vapor pressure deficit in the air is bigger, so you would expect ET to go up. This is showing the change in ET for all elevations, shown by color here, right? For all years in that 30-year record of precipitation patterns. And sometimes ET does go up. Sometimes, though, ET goes down. It goes down because that snow input gets lost as runoff, because it happens when the trees can't use it, right? It fills up that soil and then it just runs off, right? So that timing has an effect. What's interesting, though, is this shows what I'm talking about for an individual forest plot on the landscape for a particular year. So here's how the snow changed, right? Same amount of total water input, but here's your SWE, right? With the 3 degrees, you get much less snow. These are two estimates of what happens to evaporation, right? In this one, the red shows an increase in evaporation, just because the air is a little bit drier and a little bit warmer and it turns on a little bit earlier, right? This shows the same year, but with lower soil moisture storage, right? When I assume a lower soil moisture storage, right, what happens is that water runs off, the system doesn't store it, and ET actually goes down because the trees are running out of water during the late part of the season, right? So whether you assume that for this patch ET goes up in this year or goes down depends on what you assume about soil moisture storage. So this, you can leave now, is why geology matters, right? Because it's going to control, at least for this particular plot, whether ET is going to go up and your plants are going to be happier and use more water, or whether it's going to go down. And really, that's all I'm going to say. You can't really tell. I can pick on average for the basin by calibrating against stream flow what this soil parameter is, but I don't know for an individual point on the watershed what it's likely to be. So there's a lot of uncertainty. If I look at the slope of the change in ET, the change in amount of water the forests are using, given a change in snow, right, I can get a positive or a negative slope depending on over all years, over all points in the watershed, what that slope is. It's generally positive, but there's a lot of uncertainty depending on what I assume about the soil parameters, right? And I can get pretty much reasonable Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency or stream flow performances for any of these soil parameters, which means the stream flow doesn't tell me enough about what that soil storage should be. And it's really going to make a difference in terms of what I assume about how ET changes as snow changes. What do I mean by soil parameters? What do I mean by drainage parameters? So just to say a little bit about that. I mean a combination of different things. Parameters that control the amount of water that gets stored in the rooting zone. Some of those have to do with things related to how much macropores bypass water away from the tree roots, the type of soil you have, how well does it hold water, what the field capacity is for those of you that are hydrologists, but also physiological parameters that control what the rooting depths are like, right? Which is something that comes from the ecology. There are also parameters that control the drainage, and that drainage determines not just what the local storage is, but how water moves around on the landscape, right? So how much water stress you have depends on both how much water you store in your rooting zone and how snowmelt interacts with that, but also snowmelt characteristics in anything upslope or up drainage from you and the travel time distribution of that. And this is really hard information to get, right? And a lot of models don't even account for that lateral redistribution, right? What's interesting in our model, here I'm showing you our estimates of ET as a fraction of precipitation for years with different PET, right? And the black shows what I get if I account for lateral redistribution. And it's about 30%, which is a big number in terms of water use. Higher if I account for that lateral redistribution than if I don't, right? So it's a combination of both how much local storage you have, but also how the water moves around on the landscape, right? And if I account for lateral subsidy, it also changes the distribution of the change in ET with a 3-degree warming. This histogram shows the change in ET. We get increases and decreases. It actually averages about a net of 0 for this watershed, right? It's a long tail distribution, but that long tail increases if I count for lateral redistribution, right? So places on the landscape that receive subsidies, right? Because they get subsidies, sometimes they have higher rates of water use because they're getting water from above. But in years where that snowmelt really changes, they lose a lot of that subsidy, right? Because if that snow goes away in those higher elevations, they're going to get a big loss. So it's not that those areas are buffered from warming, but they have a more extreme response. They may go up more or they may go down more. So in summary, what I'm saying from this Stagehands modeling study is that it's not just, precipitation is admittedly the dominant control on how much forest water gets used, but it also matters in terms of the timing. And the timing is the thing that changes with warming. And warming can either increase or decrease forest evapotranspiration by changing the timing of snowmelt and increasing the vapor pressure deficit. And in a place like the Sierras, which way it goes completely depends on what you assume about soil moisture storage, right? And not just these sort of local soil moisture storage and its drainage characteristics, but also how water moves around on the landscape and how much of the landscape gets lateral subsidies and what happens to those. Okay, well, you might not believe me because you might say this is just this modeling study at one place. So let me give you some additional information from the Critical Zone Observatory Network, in particular the Southern Critical Zone Observatory. Critical Zone Observatories are this network of really intensively monitored sites that the National Science Foundation in the US is funding. We've talked today about some observatories you have here that we could extend this network up into Canada, which I think would be great. And at these sites, we measure all kinds of things that could help us in this question of how much water do forests use and how vulnerable is it. Things like sap flow, flux tower data. Flux tower, I'm going to talk about flux towers, can directly measure the amount of forest water use over some kind of hard to figure out footprint, right? But over some area. So we have 4 flux towers over an environmental gradient here, going from really high elevations to mid elevations to low elevations. These would probably be temperature limited. These are clearly water limited. These are somewhere in between. A lot of the work is focused on this mid elevation, and that's where we have the longest record. This is pretty new. We only have about 5 years of data. So I'm going to show you some results from a paper that just came out in PNAS by Mike Golden and Roger Bales. And so it's a little hard to think through. These red dots are ET estimates from those flux towers, right? So like I said, water limited, temperature limited, and the sweet spot at that mid elevation, right? The black line shows precipitation increasing. The green shows the ET estimates kind of based on extrapolating from those flux towers, right? And the blue shows the water yield you would get if you just take precipitation and you subtract off ET, right? This shows the area of the watershed in these different elevations, right? So you're going up in elevation here. So what you can kind of do is say, well, you know, if the amount of ET you have is really mostly controlled by temperature, right? Then as things warm, you're going to just shift this ET up to these higher elevations. And so they did that, right? They say as temperature increases, right, the total amount of ET in the watershed is going to increase because all of these areas that get lots of precipitation, maybe, a little bit more precipitation, are going to be use much more water, right? Because they're going to be that much warmer. And so they predict this drastic increase in ET. Remember, a lot of the watershed area is in these elevations. So this is going to give us a dramatic decline in stream flow. This is going to be a big problem because this is one of the big water supply catchments in the Sierras. Okay, but where's the geology in this? So let's go back to our model where we can start thinking about how geology might play in. And let me show you that indeed I can capture with the model what we see. This is daily evapotranspiration for the years that we have flux tower data at that mid-elevation really happy site. So I can estimate this with the model. But to do this, I have to give it rooting depths of greater than 5 meters, right? Or greater than 4, kind of somewhere between 4.5 and 6, depending on what I assume about how much water gets held in the soil, right? Those are big rooting depths. But actually, other water balance and soil moisture data and some actual excavation of roots would support the fact that those roots are really going down that deep, right? So we believe this, right? There's lots of kind of evidence at the CZO that the roots really go that deep. But if you go up to those high elevations where we expect to get this big increase in ET, they have much more shallower soils. It's kind of co-evolution, right? They've been colder, they haven't had as big a trees, right? So they haven't developed these deep soils. We suspect that the soils up here are actually much more shallow. So that's really going to change how you think about what happens to ET with warming, right? So I can run for this sweet spot elevation. I can look at the actual rooting depth. I can run shallower rooting depths and over a range of climate scenarios that I'm really generating by just picking from the historic climate. And I'm running some scenarios that are, different in terms of how dry they are. And I can look at the mean annual ET we get. So the blue is what we get with the actual rooting depth for that happy site, right? Which now we think is what those higher elevation sites are going to look like, because their temperature and precipitation is going to start looking like this, right? These show, half the rooting depth. This shows the rooting depth, half is 0.75 meters, which isn't an unrealistic rooting depth for these high elevation trees. Look at how much less the ET is, because you don't have that storage and you run out of water. And as we go along the x-axis here, we're going to kind of climates that are drier, right? So I'm picking drier and drier years as I go from right to left here. And we get drier. So what you also notice is not only is the mean ET less, but the sensitivity to drought dramatically increases. This would suggest to me that they're not right. And they mention this into the paper, but they don't make much of it. And I would say, well, another way of thinking about this is we're not going to get this big decline in stream flow. We're going to have trees that are going to be significantly more water stressed, right? And they're not going to be as productive because they have shallower rooting depths and they have shallower soils that don't support that level of storage. And it really is all about the storage. Okay, this plays out a little bit differently in different parts of the western US that have slightly different climates. We can compare results at the H.J. Andrews in Oregon, which gets a lot more rain. We can look at the Colorado Rockies, which gets significantly less rain, but a lot of that rain actually falls during the summer. And we can go back to our sort of more mid-elevation Sierras farther north, the Stagehands study that I talked about at the beginning. And I can do a little bit of a tricky thing, but I can compare the slope of the relationship between precipitation and ET, right? So how much additional ET you get with more precipitation for different assumptions about what the soil water holding capacity is, right? So if the slope is higher, it means you're more sensitive to changes in precipitation. You're more sensitive to drought, right? So not surprisingly, that sensitivity goes down as you get more soil moisture storage, right? In the Andrews, where you get lots of rain, that sensitivity only goes up if you get really, really shallow soils, right? In Colorado, it's always really sensitive and soil moisture storage doesn't matter as much. That is because it rains a lot more often and because it rains in the summer. But in the Sierras, where you really have a dry system where all that water is happening as snowmelt, you get a very strong sensitivity here. The scatter here has to do with what I assume. This is all local storage. This scatter is what I assume about the redistribution effect. So it's both sensitive to how much storage you have locally, but also to redistribution, which creates this scatter. So you have a really sensitive system, both to how much precip you get. You get almost the same pattern if we look at the sensitivity of AET to the timing of precipitation. So everything I've said so far up until now has really focused on how forest water use responds to drought and how important understanding what their storage is in these systems, particularly in a place like the Sierras. But I've kind of assumed that the vegetation doesn't change. It doesn't respond to drought. It doesn't grow. It doesn't. And that's not really true. So what we really want is to look at this more dynamic response. So first, I'm going to show you some empirical results. So this is an index of drought stress developed by Park Williams that he published in Nature Climate Change. And it really is just winter precipitation minus vapor pressure deficit, right? So it's a very climatically driven index of drought. And all these kind of vegetation things that we might be interested in correlate really nicely with that drought index. That drought index is shown in red here. NDVI correlates with it, which is productivity. The percent of trees that die due to drought stress correlate with it. The bark beetle area correlates with it, and wildfire area correlates with it, right? So it's clear that drought is deeply affecting vegetation structure, either through productivity, through fire, through beetles. All these things change the amount of vegetation you have on the landscape. But the thing about this index is this is done over a large region in the Southwest. It doesn't really tell you what's going to happen in a particular place, in a particular watershed, and how sensitive that's going to be, right? That's where you need models like this that can really tease out the more local place-based responses. And you can kind of see that here. This is actually some results from Spain, but I show them to you because they have them for a fairly long period of time. This is looking at the correlation of tree rings with, in this case, really can't get this thing working very well. I'm going to give up. It shows, this graph shows the relationship between tree rings and Rhesus simulated MPP. The above shows those same tree rings with different climatic water deficits, indices. And they get reasonable correlations for some of them, but there's a lot of noise. The reason I think the model does better is that it accounts for the relationship between your daily inputs of recharge or precipitation, your daily demands, and how those interact with storage. And you have to put those together at a fairly fine time step in order to really match the way in which climate affects productivity. Okay. We also, I thought I took these out, we also do a pretty good job of capturing drought stress. We can capture other things, like this shows some results from one of those southwest catchments that had some of that dieback due to drought stress, right? And we're able to do a good job of capturing stream flow. We kind of get seasonal difference or interannual differences in tree ring widths. We capture kind of literature estimates of carbon stores for that type of vegetation. And we more or less capture the spatial pattern of vegetation on the landscape. So we're trying to do these different things to say that we can capture not just hydrologic variables, but also the linkages with growth. What's really interesting, though, is if we calibrate this model to get stream flow, and then we run it through the drought, and we run it in two different ways. One, where we assume the vegetation closes its snow mats, it responds physiologically to the lack of water, but it doesn't change its structure. It doesn't start dropping needles, right? It doesn't change. We get about a 50% error in the prediction of stream flow relative to observed. If we account for the change in structure in the vegetation, the decline in productivity, that error in stream flow prediction goes away, which says accounting for these changes in vegetation structure matter in terms of predicting vegetation water use and ultimately stream flow. Now, if you're really clever, you're going to go, oh, well, then we can manage vegetation to affect stream flow, right? That's kind of what I'm saying. We can do what the drought does. We can start changing vegetation structure. We do that all the time. We thin, we log, we control burn. How does that play out? And in the Western US, there's a lot of focus on trying to deal with these large areas of land where, because of decades of fire suppression, we have forests that are probably denser than they would have been if we hadn't fire suppressed. So there's a lot of agency push to say we could do things like fuel treatments. So you've got to ask then, if we do this, right, will it increase stream flow, going back to water for us during droughts? And even better, will it reduce water stress for the remaining trees, right? So that they're less likely to get infested by beetles, they're going to be more resilient to severe fires, they will be happier as well. So everybody benefits, right? Win-win for all. And, this is decades and decades of hydrologic research have asked this question about, do we get more stream flow if we take away vegetation? And you can look at reviews. This is a relatively recent one from Brown et al. In 2005. And yeah, when you take away forests, you sort of get increases in water yield. It's worth noting they change a lot. The slope of these lines change for different species, and there's a lot of scatter, right? Even at 80% cover reduction, right, there's a big difference. The other thing is, when you do these changes, they don't last. Forests grow back, right? If you look at data, if you look at some studies for four-paired catchment studies in the US, right, and you look at how that change in water yield, yeah, there was an initial change in water yield, but by 15 years after treatment, in some of those studies, you were getting less water yield due to things like a change in species. What's really interesting, though, is when you go to the Southwest, these places that are really dry, where we're concerned about all these issues, and you look at what happened after this 2000 drought that killed off a bunch of trees, just kind of more at this smaller scale. You're not wiping out 80% of the trees in the landscape. This shows changes in water yield, right? And in some watersheds, it looks like there's an increase. But in some watersheds, and I mean 2 or 3 years, not 15 years after that, we see declines in stream flow, right? There's some issues with how they figure this out. It's not a perfect experiment, right? It wasn't a formal care catchment experiment. They're just taking advantage of the fact that a bunch of trees died with the drought. But still, why this decline in stream flow, right? If you look at other studies that look specifically at thinning, right, where you go into a forest and thin, yeah, some of them show declines in ET, not that much, even with a 50% reduction in LAI, only about a 15% reduction. But some of them also show no change, because really what shifts is the ET from overstory to ET in the understory, right? So there's lots of reasons for figuring out why that might happen. So let's use the model to kind of tease out what might explain why sometimes you get increases in ET and sometimes you don't, and sometimes you actually get decreases, right? So we can go back to our Sierra site, and with the model you can play with these scenarios. You can account for the effect of climate variation by running a thinning scenario where you thin in every possible year and then you let the forest grow back over time, right? So you can count for climate variation both in the year right after you thin, but in the whole regrowth period, right? And I did a 40% thinning treatment and about a 20-year recovery. And this isn't going to come as a surprise, I did it for shallow soils and I did it for deep soils, the soils that we actually have at that CZO and the soils that we would have if we went upslope a little bit. And, here's what happens. Here's the change in ET 5 years after thinning, about a 40% thin of the canopy, right? About giving it 5 years to grow back. There's a distribution because this is all possible years, right? So all possible 5 years in the climate record. There's 2 graphs. One shows with competition, one shows without. With competition is when I let the remaining trees have access to that water that the thin trees used to use. Now, this is an interesting question. We don't know whether or not that occurs. This is lateral redistribution at a pretty micro scale, but you'll see it's really important. So the deep soils, shown in green, show much less reduction in ET, right? Which makes sense. The shallow soils show like a difference between a 5% reduction to a 25%, right? Again, showing that it's in places with shallow soils that you see these real sensitivities. But if I allow for competition, right, the shape, particularly of the shallow soil, changes. And in a small but important part, some of those climate trajectories actually do show decreases in evapotranspiration because the remaining trees actually do better, use more ET, enough to more than compensate for the reduction in vegetation, right? Because they grow more in those bad years, so they just have bigger capacity to use water, right? So this explains why sometimes you get increases and sometimes you get decreases. Partly it's due to climate, right? You can go from 30%, and I think this is more what it actually looks like. You can go from 30% to 5%, partly based on the climate trajectories that you get. And when you do paired catchments, you only get one climate trajectory. But it also really depends on the depth of the soil. And we can see this we've done this kind of analysis in other places, in the Santa Fe municipal water supply catchment. These are a little hard to look through, but this shows change in transpiration and evaporation and stream flow, again, distributed over many, many possible climate trajectories, both immediately after thinning, 10 years. The different colors tell us what happens on south versus north-facing aspects and on different soils. And as you can see, it's a little messy, but just get that these different colored lines look really different. So again, where you are, even in a particular watershed, this is a small, say, second-order stream, the north-facing and south-facing slopes recover very differently. Shallow and deep soils behave very differently, even in the same place. So really, what am I saying, right? I'm kind of saying that spatial variation, right, because soils vary like they did in the CZO along elevational gradients, right, and the fact that we don't know that much about them, right, is really important for estimates of ET, its sensitivity to climate, the impact of forest management on stream flow, and the vulnerability of these systems to things like fire, drought, insects, etc., right? Now, if you were a good Canadian trained hydrologist like myself, you'd be going, I learned this, right? Dunn and Leopold, the classic hydrology textbooks will talk about things like field capacity, right? And they'll say that controls water storage, and that's going to affect the amount of available water for ET. So why are we still talking about this, right? We know this. But I think the problem is that we do a lot of hydrologic modeling. We do a lot of interpretation of empirical results, like some of the ones I've shown you, without accounting for this, because we don't really know what these storage values are. They're not well represented by soil maps. Dunn and Leopold will tell you what a sand does versus a clay, but it won't really tell you what the actual soil water holding capacity is, because it doesn't account for things like macropores, rocks in the soil, and it doesn't tell you anything about what that rooting depth is, right, which is a biological response. So you get papers like this, right, that don't say anything about soil, right? So what I'm doing is kind of going from this empirical analysis and to say how much would accounting for spatial differences in these soil properties make in terms of our interpretation of those empirical results, right? And what do they mean for going forward? It's also really important because often our underlying assumptions about what these storage capacities, rooting depths are wrong, right? It would be okay if we could make good guesses, but we often don't make good guesses, right? In the Sierras, yeah, we're pretty sure that the soils are shallower up top and at mid-elevations. But in a lot of watersheds, for example, a lot of watershed hydrologists will tell you that soils get deeper as you go down slope. This is some ground-penetrating radar for the CZO, and the soils do not get deeper as you go down slope, right? And people there used to think that that was how it worked, right? Now that we have instrumentation that actually looks at soil profiles, and Jeff can speak to this, they don't always look the way we think, right? So that means our underlying assumptions may be really wrong. We have to do these kinds of uncertainty analysis to say, like they did in the situations that I showed you, when it really matters. If you think back, when I showed you for Colorado, didn't really make a difference, right? The sensitivity to precipitation is always the same, right? It doesn't really matter what you know about soils. In the Andrews, probably only matters if you think the soils are really, really shallow, right, for the trees. But for places like the Sierras where there's not that much water and it comes in at one point in the year, it really matters, right? And there's innovative things we need to think about, not just in terms of what that rooting zone is, how much water the soil can hold, how it gets redistributed, or that it gets redistributed, but also how it gets redistributed, right? There's different models out there, different conceptual models for how water gets moved around on the landscape. And I think I've shown you that moving water around the landscape can affect watershed scale ET estimates, sometimes by as much as 30%. So it matters how you move things around. Jeff McDonald and some of his colleagues have been advocating this notion that we used to think we often model as this kind of transmissivity profile with some macropores, right? Where as the water table rises, it moves more quickly because the saturated hydrologic conductivity decays exponentially with depth. But it may not work like that, right? It may be more these little micro reservoirs that fill up and then spill, right? If we represent those, we did this actually for a watershed near Santa Barbara, but that still has this big pulses of water during the winter. We get really different estimates of the amount of transpiration. Because basically, if we assume the transmissivity option, you're always kind of connecting at least parts of the subsurface. So you're getting a little bit more continuous lateral subsidy throughout the season. That gives you a little bit more transpiration. the model predicts a little bit more growth in the riparian zone, which actually isn't true if you go out on there. There isn't as much on the landscape forests or big trees in the riparian zone. So I think actually the fill and spill is more correct here. What all of this means is that for asking these questions about how much water forests use, how that affects stream flow, and how sensitive it is to climate, we need better measurements to say something about what that soil storage is, right? And it has to be the soil storage that the plants see, right? I think we can get at that by doing a better job. We learned a lot by looking at that flux tower. From that, coupled with the model, I was able to back out what that soil storage actually had to be, right? You can do the same thing with things like sap flow, right? But they have to be coupled with things like local meteorology measures, right? And you want to be distributing these things along geologic features, places where you think there might be difference in these soil characteristics, right? The difference in soil depth that we expect along that Sierra gradient. You want to be able to sample that. So you want to be going out there and thinking about the landform evolution and essentially the geology, and then going out and instrumenting in this way that I think we can start to get a better handle on what these storage capacities are. We can combine this with spatial products that tell us, particularly in water-limited environments, where the vegetation is productive, right? But you really need to link it with models, right? Models allow you, as I did here, right, to back out sometimes what that storage would have to be in order to have the productivity or the ET flux that you're seeing in the productivity that you're seeing in the remote sensing, or the fluxes that you're seeing from your sap flow data, right? So I'm kind of going to end here, so I got down to 45 minutes, by saying, you know, when we're looking at these watershed scale responses, right, I think, you know, we have sort of classical models out there, but sometimes they're not correct. And I think it's for a combination of these factors, right? A lot of the things that I've been talking about here are the fact that hill slopes are more than just a box of soil, right? They have these storage capacities that are not well defined and don't always look the way we used to think they look, right? I haven't talked so much about this, but there's a lot of literature now in plant physiology about when do trees die and how do they regulate water use with their stomats, and do they do that in different ways, and how do different species respond? And I haven't even talked about that. And then there's all kinds of stuff about getting micro-scale meteorology. A lot of predictions we make from really poor meteorology products, right? If you actually go out and measure snow, you find it's very heterogeneous on the landscape, right? And so that water input is also, I think, more heterogeneous than we think, and sometimes that is a big number. So this is kind of my vision for where I think we need to move forward in terms of forest eco-hydrology, and really doing a better job of understanding how drought affects both water for forests and their health, and ultimately how much water we have in streams that we use. So this is really where I want to see us going, and with that I think I'll take questions.
Sorry, I'm trapped here by my microphone. That's good. So questions for Naomi.
Is that me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, sure. Naomi, that was really interesting. So one of the things that we're thinking about here in the Saskatchewan boreal forest is shifts in vegetation types that have different functional traits, and particularly from needle leaf conifers with evergreen foliage to broadleaf deciduous trees. And we know from our flux tower data that those have big effects on evapotranspiration. And so we're thinking that that changing forest structure is probably going to influence the hydrology. And I'm wondering if that's a question that you have grappled with in your model, is shifting vegetation, not just competition of allocation among trees, but what if the types of trees and the hydrologic conductivity of the vegetation changes with some shift in vegetation composition? Yeah,
I'm definitely thinking about that. So, you know, it's interesting. In the Andrews, there was a paired catchment experiment where, you know, they logged something and then the forest grows back. and the water use goes down. And largely the reason is because you got a bunch of alder in the riparian zone. And in fact, for us to get that decline for that site, we had to put alder in the riparian zone, which is what you're talking about, the shift from the needle leaf to the deciduous. We've tried to play this out a little bit in, there is this question about which uses more water, right? And it's not just the conductance of the tree, right? It's sort of that, conifers are more conductive, right? But it's the growing season length. And so it gets a little, deciduous are more essentially could use more water faster, but the conifers can use it longer. I think there's some really interesting questions there about the interaction effect of that and the climate. Because I think which one uses more water isn't a constant thing. But just to answer your question, yeah, I think these shifts in species are really important, right? I think the other million-dollar question, which is related to this storage idea, is, and we know so little about, or how do trees under drought allocate their roots, right? So if I get primary productivity, how much do I put to roots? And I can constrain that a little bit in the model because I can look and make sure I get the right amount of above ground biomass. If I put everything to roots, my trees will die because I can constrain it, but that constraint's pretty limited, right? That still gives me a real pretty wide range of different allocations of NPP to roots. And do you adapt that? Do you start allocating more to roots when you're water stressed? And that starts to mean that you're changing your storage. The storage isn't just soil, it's also how much you allocate to roots. And I think that's one of the other big missing pieces, right? So it's not just species, but it's also, even within a species, does it change its allocation strategy? And I don't think we really know the answer to that. And clearly these answers will be different depending on what I assume.
I was just wondering, they're showing that leaf conductance has a strong relationship with CO2. Right? So as CO2 levels increase, there's going to be a decrease in the amount of stomata on the leaf, right? Which results in, then, of course, going to be a reduction in ET. So how do you incorporate, like structural changes within leaves that are going to happen with CO2 for future sort of ET predictions?
Right. So there's a couple of sort of levels of answering that. One is partly, even if the structure of the leaf doesn't change, right, you get a little bit more bang for your buck if CO2 is elevated in the atmosphere, right? Because for the same time you spend for the same amount of ET, you get more CO2 in, right? And that we already account for in the model because that's easy to do, right? We just change the atmospheric CO2 concentration in the model and it accounts for that. These kind of...
Change, yeah. But so the plant doesn't change though.
Yeah, the plant doesn't change. How to change the plant with that, I don't know enough to know how I would represent that in the model, right? What you're talking about is an empirical relationship, but I need a little bit more. And studies are kind of mixed in terms of whether, I don't think it's, people have done, if you do it in the lab, yes, it works out like that. When you do it in the field, studies I've read from the Western US, it doesn't always play out that water use efficiency goes up with elevated CO2, right? CO2 has been going up, and it's hard to actually extract an empirical effect of that in an actual forest, right? So, because a bunch of things change. So I'm not sure. I don't think it's clear cut that exactly how that change is going to realize. So it's hard to model.
Yeah, so just wondering how we're going to take into account in the future.
I don't know.
Great, students from class. We ran out of time this morning. Lucy, Alan, Eloise. Lucy had her hand up, I think. Yeah.
I was thinking when you cut a part of a forest, you will also change the radiation fluxes. So that could be also a reason to increase the evapotranspiration when you cut the part of it.
In what way? Yes, you do change. Well, you certainly change radiation absorption, and it depends on where you cut, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we account for that. So in our model, for example, we attenuate radiation as you go through the canopy, right? So you get a different response if you cut understory versus something beside. But we model the radiation differently for that thin part and not. So we account for those differences. So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the change in radiation.
No, that kind of change.
Yeah.
So you can increase the evapotranspiration not just for the forest competition for
Oh, for the
water.
soil, yeah.
Also for the changes in the radiation.
Yeah, I mean, we do account for the fact, and this is why sometimes in the really semi-arid, right, it often doesn't work out that you get more evapotranspiration when you thin or after some of these plants die, because all you do, you get less transpiration, but you just get more evaporation, because that energy that used to, you know, the soil that used to be shaded, right, now gets more radiation, and so you get more soil evaporation. We account for that, and that sometimes is the reason you get less stream flow after thinning, right? If for some reason that soil evaporation might even be higher, right? It's more understory, right? What happens is your understory gets more productive because suddenly your understory isn't shaded, it gets much more radiation. So you're right, part of the story is radiation, right?
Okay, thanks. Oh, sorry.
Is there any effect of the wind direction or the wind flow in terms of intensity? Because then it would affect the vapor pressure deficit if it's a hot, humid air and then more ET, or no?
So in these areas, things are pretty well mixed, right? So, you know, it's not like you get this buildup of moisture in the air right above the canopy, or we don't think. So we assume that it's not very coupled in this particular system, right? But what I thought you were going to ask, which is a bigger problem, so I'll give it to you, even though I shouldn't, right, is the thinning issue. The one thing, when you have higher wind speeds, right, you create more eddies and you're more efficient at evaporation, right? And we account for that in the model. But what I don't account for is when you thin, you might change microscale wind speeds, right? Yeah. And that's a hard one, right? Like how you account for that, I'm not so sure, right? And so that might drive up evaporative fluxes, not just from the radiation I can do, right? But the fact that as you create clearings, you might create, you know, more turbulent flux.
Yeah, I mean, then larger the canopy and then it has a less effect on the inner side of the, I mean, inner branches or inner leaves.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that sort of micro scale changes are really hard to.
Okay, thank you.
Louise, you want to ask?
Sure, I'll ask a question. So you mentioned you do your research in California. I was just wondering, why do they have so many drought problems over there? And if like the whole world is experiencing climate change, they seem to have the most issues with the water.
Maybe we're just louder. But I'll answer it. So the recent drought, right, is just partly just we had a couple of really low precipitation years in a row, right? But and it's been severe enough that you're actually starting to see, you know, drought dieback in natural vegetation. But the main reason California has all these problems, right, is that we developed a water allocation system during a fairly wet period, right? So the other problem is that the water, from a person perspective, why you hear about drought in California, right, is because our water is probably over allocated, right? I mean, and so when we, you know, we have climate variability. You're always going to have low precipitation years. But if you develop your allocation of water resources under pretty wet conditions, right, then you're going to over allocate your resources, right? And so it becomes really problematic when we have droughts, right? In terms of climate change, you know, it's pretty clear that climate change is occurring, right? And we're seeing these increases in temperature, right? You can see that in the record, right? And of course, there's physical reasons why, you know, because we're putting greenhouse gases, we expect climate change to occur. What's tricky with drought is that drought is certainly affected by temperature, but it's also very strongly affected by precipitation. And how increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, increasing greenhouse gases affects precipitation is harder to figure out, right? So whether we're going to see, you know, there's some evidence now, though, globally, of seeing increasing droughts in declines in precipitation in certain places, right? It's hard. We need a longer period of time before you can really work that out statistically. And those places will be increasingly. So there's a climate reason for drought, but there's also a human resource allocation reason for drought, right? And right now, in California, we have a nexus of both of those things. So that's why it looks really bad. But I zero-escape my yard to help with the drought.
draw it to a close. We're just after 5. Join us at Alexander's after for a beer and more questions for Naomi. And Naomi, thanks for a really interesting insight into these eco-hydrological issues. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.